The signal had been dead for 11 years. Dr. Vetha Sohn knew this because she had been the one to file the termination report. Galactic Biological Survey, Expedition 4471, Species Contact Protocol, terminated, reclassified, archived. She remembered typing the final line of that report in her office on Kelth Station, the pale green light of her monitor reflecting off the chitinous plates of her wrists, while the last automated probe from designation GH-Rathroman 4 transmitted its final telemetry burst and went silent. 11 years, 4 months, 9 standard days. She had not thought about that planet since. Until the signal came back. Not from the probe. The probe was dead, its power cells had a projected lifespan of 6 years, and it had exceeded that by 18 months before the telemetry flatlined. This signal was new. It carried a Galactic Biological Survey header that matched Expedition 4471's encryption key, but the data structure was wrong. The packet format had been altered. The compression algorithm was non-standard, and the signal strength was roughly 40 times what the probe had been capable of producing. Vetha sat in her office on Kelth Station and stared at the decoded first line of the transmission for a long time. The words were simple. They were in standard Galactic, and they should not have existed. Expedition 4471. Field update. Population census revised. Requesting biological survey team return for reclassification. She read it again, then a third time. Her mouthparts clicked together, an involuntary stress response her species had never evolved past, despite 1,400 years of civilization. She opened the original expedition file and began to read from the beginning, the way a surgeon reviews a chart before cutting. GH-Rathroman 4. The file was thin. Most contact termination files were. Class 9, Deathworld in the GH-Rath system's habitable zone, third orbital body. 1.14, standard gravity, atmospheric composition within breathable parameters for carbon-based megafauna, but with an oxygen percentage that the survey team's atmospheric chemist had flagged as aggressively oxidative. Mean surface temperature oscillated between extremes that would kill most cataloged sentient species within hours of unprotected exposure. Tectonic instability rated at 7.2 on the Cithrani scale. Hydrological volatility. The planet's weather in simple terms was described in the file as persistent, violent, and unpredictable. The survey team's climatologist had added a personal note to the margin. This planet is trying to kill everything on it, and it is doing a remarkably thorough job. The dominant fauna were large, fast, territorial, and almost universally venomous, armored, or both. The apex predator was a warm-blooded biped averaging 1.7 to 1.9 meters in height, massing between 60 and 110 kilograms depending on sex and regional variant. Bipedal locomotion, forward-facing binocular vision, an endoskeleton reinforced by a calcium phosphate mineral matrix that could absorb impact forces exceeding anything the survey team's biomechanical models had predicted. The species hunted in coordinated groups. It used tools. It modified its environment. And it communicated in a system of modulated pressure waves produced by a muscular organ in its throat that the survey team's linguist had spent 4 months trying to decode before the funding ran out. The assessment was straightforward. GH-Rathroman 4 dominant species, cataloged as GH-Rathroman 4 alpha in the file, though they apparently called themselves something unpronounceable that the linguist had transliterated as Hyumance, was pre-industrial. Stone tools, rudimentary agriculture, permanent settlements clustered along river systems and coastlines. Threat rating, contained. The species was confined to its planet by the obvious fact that it had not developed faster-than-light travel, atmospheric exit capability, or any form of off-world communication. It was stuck. It would remain stuck. The galaxy had nothing to fear from a planet-bound species of warm-blooded bipeds who hadn't figured out metallurgy beyond copper. The survey team recommended termination of active monitoring. The Biological Survey Board agreed. The probes were left running on automatic until their power cells died, and the file was archived. Vetha had signed the closure order herself, stamped with her academic credentials and her survey license number, and moved on to the next assignment. Gatrathroman 4 became a line item in a database that held 11 million similar entries: planets with life, planets with potential, planets that would never matter. 11 years. She remembered the day she had closed the file, not because it was memorable, but because it was not. It had been a Tuesday. She had processed 7 termination reports that morning. Gatrathroman 4 was the 4th. She had read the summary, checked the data against the board's minimum monitoring thresholds, confirmed the species fell below the development trait cutoff for sustained observation, and entered the termination code. 4 minutes. 4 minutes to close the book on a species, on a world, on 300 million lives that would go on living and dying and building their stone tools without ever knowing they had been observed, assessed, and dismissed by a civilization so far above them that the distance was not a gap but a category error. She had not felt guilty. The data had been clear. The species was pre-industrial. Its development rate was within normal parameters for a warm-blooded biped on a high-gravity Deathworld. At the observed rate of technological progression, Gatrathroman 4 Alpha would achieve spaceflight capability in approximately 12 to 14,000 standard years. There was no urgency. There was no threat. There was nothing interesting enough about a planet full of tool-using predators to justify continued expenditure when 11 million other worlds competed for the same budget. The data had been clear, and the data had been wrong. Vetha pulled the new signal apart piece by piece over the next 3 days. She worked alone in her office with the door sealed and her personal terminal disconnected from the station's shared network. This was not protocol. Protocol required immediate reporting of any anomalous signal bearing a survey encryption key. Vetha ignored protocol because the data was wrong in ways she needed to understand before she let anyone else frame the questions. The signal originated from the surface of Gatrathroman 4. Not from the probe's last known position, from a point 4,200 kilometers northeast of it, on a landmass the original survey had designated Continent 3. The signal was clean. No atmospheric distortion, no ionospheric scatter, no noise. It had been transmitted through what the frequency analysis suggested was a purpose-built directional array. Not repurposed survey equipment, but something constructed from raw materials to a specification that mimicked Galactic standard comm architecture, while deviating in ways that suggested the builders understood the principles, but had developed their own solutions for the components they couldn't replicate. The builders. She kept coming back to that word. The probe was dead. No other galactic species had filed a claim on the Gatrath system. The signal bore the encryption key of Expedition 4471, which meant whoever sent it had accessed the probe's memory core, had found it, opened it, decoded its operating system, extracted the encryption key, and then built a transmitter powerful enough to reach Kelth Station from a planet the galaxy had forgotten. In 11 years. The second decoded packet arrived 41 hours after the first. A census. Crude but internally consistent population organized by geographic region, subdivisions corresponding to the original survey's continental mapping system. The species had used the probe's geographic data as a baseline and built their own census framework around it, with modifications demonstrating a working understanding of planetary geodesy. The numbers were the first thing that frightened her. Expedition 4471 had estimated the total population at approximately 300 million individuals. The census reported 1.4 billion. Vetha checked her math 3 times. She pulled every demographic model in the survey database, 17 models, covering species with gestational cycles from days to decades. No cataloged species in 11 million entries had ever demonstrated a population increase of that magnitude in that timeframe without external intervention. GH Rathroman 4 alpha had no artificial breeding programs, no genetic modification, no colonial transplantation. They had river valleys and stone tools, and a deathworld trying to kill them every hour. And they had quadrupled their numbers in 11 years. The third packet contained technical specifications, not a greeting, not a plea, a schematic, detailed, precise, annotated in a mathematical notation built from first principles. Vetha's algorithms needed 4 hours to parse it. When they finished, she sat very still. A propulsion system, complete engineering schematic, materials specs, fuel cycle parameters, thrust-to-mass ratios, thermal tolerances, structural load calculations, projected failure modes, based on principles that were sound but that no species had ever implemented in that configuration because the engineering tolerances were considered impractical. Projected performance, 0.4 C, 40% of light speed. Not faster than light, but fast enough to cross a solar system, fast enough to reach the nearest star in decades, fast enough to leave. The design wasn't elegant. It was brute force engineering, massive fuel expenditure, enormous waste heat, tolerances at the ragged edge of physics. A Drethani engineer would have called it barbaric. A Tethvari physicist would have called it inelegant. Neither would have built it because galactic engineering prioritized efficiency. This species didn't care about elegance. It cared about whether the thing would work, and it would work. She filed her report that evening. Raw data, decoded packets, census, schematic, no editorializing, priority 1, went to her quarters. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the rate of change, not the absolute numbers but the slope of the curve. She thought about what the curve looked like extended forward another 11 years, and another, and she stopped because the answer was not something she could process alone in the dark. The board convened within 6 hours. Vetha was questioned for 4 hours, asked to verify every data point. She did. Every number held. The board deliberated for 2 days. On the third day, Expedition 4471R, the R stood for reclassification. The Cathalis survey class, unarmed, built for patience. Crew of 19 specialists. Vetha designated chief biologist and expedition lead. The planet was hers. She had signed it off. Now she was being sent back to explain what she had signed off on. 28 days in transit. Vetha spent them reviewing everything in the database. The original survey data was thin, 4 months of probe observation, tissue samples, atmospheric readings, the linguist's incomplete phonetic analysis. She watched the probe's visual recordings, 17 times grainy footage of bipedal predators building with wood and stone, tending fields, carrying young on their backs. She found herself watching their eyes, forward-facing, binocular, predator eyes. Even in mundane footage, farming, building, carrying children, the eyes were scanning, always tracking, never still. Every face carried the quiet alertness of a species that had evolved surrounded by things that wanted to eat it and had decided the correct response was not to hide but to look back. On day 14 of the transit, Vetha compiled a risk assessment for the board standard procedure for any reclassification expedition. The document required her to estimate the probability that the target species posed a direct threat to the Cathalis and its crew. She stared at the blank field for 20 minutes. The standard answer for a pre-FTL species on a deathworld was negligible. The species couldn't reach orbit, couldn't detect a shielded survey vessel, couldn't engage anything above its atmosphere. She had written negligible on dozens of risk assessments for dozens of worlds. She wrote indeterminate and moved on. It was the first time in her career she had used that classification. The rest of the transit passed in the particular tension of a crew heading toward something unprecedented and running out of ways to prepare. The geologist recalibrated her tectonic sensors. The weapons specialist, a board primarily for fauna threat assessment, quietly ran simulations on projectile weapon performance envelopes against ship hull materials. The linguist built translation matrices from the 12 language fragments in the original data, knowing they would be inadequate but building them anyway because the alternative was to sit and think about what was waiting at the other end of the transit corridor. Everyone prepared. No one said what they were preparing for. The footage was 11 years old. What she was flying toward was something else entirely. On day 14 of the transit, Vetha compiled a risk assessment for the board standard procedure for any reclassification expedition. The document required her to estimate the probability that the target species posed a threat to the Cathalis and its crew. She stared at the blank field for 20 minutes. The standard answer for a pre-FTL species on a Deathworld was negligible. The species couldn't reach orbit, couldn't detect a shielded survey vessel, and couldn't engage anything above its own atmosphere even if it could detect it. She had written negligible on dozens of risk assessments, for dozens of species on dozens of worlds. She wrote indeterminate and moved on. It was the first time in her career she had used that classification. The rest of the transit passed in the particular tension of a crew that knows it is heading toward something unprecedented and has run out of ways to prepare for it. The geologist recalibrated her tectonic sensors. The weapons specialist, who was supposed to be aboard primarily for fauna threat assessment, ran simulations on projectile weapon performance envelopes. The linguist built translation matrices from the 12 language fragments in the original survey data, knowing they would be inadequate. Everyone prepared. No one said what they were preparing for. They dropped out of transit at the GHRATH system's edge and ran passive scans for 6 hours. Yellow main sequence star, 8 orbital bodies, the third in the habitable zone. No artificial structures in orbit. No emissions beyond what the signal had demonstrated. Almost. The communications officer, a slender Tethvari named On, whose species processed electromagnetic spectra the way Vetha's processed chemical gradients, routed his findings to her station without comment. The Tethvari way of saying something was deeply wrong. The planet's electromagnetic profile had changed. Beneath the natural baseline, tectonic heat, atmospheric discharge, biological signatures, there was something else. A hum. Low frequency, planet-wide, faint enough to almost disappear against geological noise. Structured, coherent, everywhere. It's a power grid, On said finally. Chromatophores shifting amber unease. Planet-wide, buried or shielded. Energy output consistent with a mid-stage industrial civilization, comparable to the Drethani 2,000 years before orbital capability. They were using stone tools 11 years ago. Yes. Silence, the kind that fills a room when everyone arrives at the same impossible answer. Vetha ordered the approach. The Cathalis entered high orbit on day 29. The optical sensors resolved the surface, and Vetha's mouthparts clicked so hard 2 team members turned to stare. Cities. Not the clustered riverside settlements of the original survey, small organic groupings of wooden structures surrounded by cultivated land that the ethnographer had compared to early-stage agrarian communities documented on 17 other worlds. These were cities, dense, structured, vertical, sprawling across every continent, concentrated along the same river systems and coastlines where the original settlements had stood but expanded outward and upward in ways that shattered every developmental timeline in the database. Roads connected them, visible from orbit, long pale lines cutting across continental surfaces like surgical incisions drawn by a steady hand. The roads were straight, aggressively, defiantly straight. Where a mountain range stood in the path, the road did not curve around it. It went through. They're tunneling through mountain ranges, the geologist said from her station. Her voice was flat, a scientist watching her models break in real time. Through active tectonic zones, That requires materials science we assess as mid to late industrial minimum. Seismic bracing, reinforced linings, ventilation systems for the interior sections. 11 years ago they didn't have iron. Each orbital pass added another layer, and each layer was worse than the last. Population. The census figure of 1.4 billion had been accurate months ago. Current extrapolation from thermal and metabolic signatures measured in real time, 1.6 billion, and climbing at a rate the demographic models flagged as unprecedented. They had agriculture on a scale the food production models said shouldn't work on a death world. Vast geometric patterns of cultivated land visible from orbit, irrigated by canal systems that diverted entire rivers from their natural courses and redistributed water across terrain that had been arid scrubland in the original survey footage. They had industry, atmospheric pollutant signatures consistent with metallurgical smelting, chemical processing, combustion-based energy generation, concentrated in zones adjacent to major urban centers. They had waterborne vessels on every navigable body of water, some clearly ocean-going, large-hulled metal superstructure craft, with profiles the database classified as blue water-capable military and commercial shipping. Military vessels, 11 years after stone tools. Vetha began composing notes for her preliminary assessment. She wrote, "Rate of transition exceeds all catalogued precedents by approximately 2 orders of magnitude." She deleted it and wrote, "No existing model accounts for this rate of development." She deleted that too. Both statements were accurate. Neither conveyed what the data actually meant. That every assumption the Galactic Biological Survey used to predict the trajectory of emerging species was not slightly wrong, not requiring adjustment, but fundamentally, categorically wrong. She ordered descent to low orbit. The cities were engineered. Buildings of processed stone, fired ceramics, iron, steel, and at least 2 alloys the spectroscopic analysis couldn't match. Street layouts, grids in newer sections, organic growth in older cores. The species was building faster than it could plan and learning from its failures, applying corrections to newer districts in real time. It was iterating at the scale of entire cities while those cities continued to grow. The newer construction was overtaking the infrastructure beneath it, roads laid for foot traffic being widened for wheeled vehicles while adjacent buildings rose. Rather than pausing to consolidate, they built faster. The observation team monitored construction sites for 40 hours straight and confirmed the work never stopped. Not for weather, not for darkness. They lit construction sites with the same electrical illumination they used for everything else and kept building through the night. The observation team's work pattern analyst estimated that the species maintained an average active labor cycle of approximately 16 hours per individual per day, a figure that exceeded every comparable data point in the survey's ergonomic database by 40%. There were vehicles wheeled, combustion-powered, streaming along road networks in continuous flows that exceeded traffic algorithm parameters. There were watercraft dwarfing anything the original survey recorded, large-hulled vessels with angular military profiles, and what the weapons specialist reluctantly identified as probable weapons emplacements. And on the 43rd pass, crossing the night side of Continent 2, the observation team stopped breathing. Light, not bioluminescence, not fire though millions of combustion sources dotted the surface. Concentrated, intense, organized. Blue-white points clustered in cities like nodes in a neural network, strung along roads in continuous chains, marking coastlines and mountain passes. Electrical lighting. Artificial illumination requiring generation, transmission, distribution, and continuous maintenance. 11 years, the chief engineer said quietly. Drethani, four-armed, scholarly, methodical, upper hands perfectly still on the console, which meant his lower hands were trembling beneath the desk. No cataloged species has made this transition in 11 years. The fastest recorded, the Palathi, took 600 years with naturally occurring surface metals. Roman 4 had none. They invented metallurgy, mining, smelting, alloys, electrical generation, everything from scratch. With a population that quadrupled simultaneously, Vetha said, on a Class 9 Deathworld, while the planet tried to kill them. Every single day. The chief engineer pulled up a comparative development timeline on the hollow table, a standard chart showing the technological curves of every spacefaring species in the Galactic database plotted against time. The curves were long, gentle, predictable, hundreds of thousands of years of gradual progression, punctuated by occasional acceleration events. The Drethani curve was considered fast, stone tools to FTL in 28,000 years. The Tethvari had taken 41,000. The galactic average sat around 35,000. Roman 4 Alpha's curve was a vertical line. On the chart's scale, it was indistinguishable from a species that had made the transition instantaneously. The chief engineer stared at it, then quietly closed the display. "The chart doesn't work," he said. "The axes aren't scaled for this. Nothing we have is scaled for this." Vetha looked at the blank space where the chart had been and understood something she had been resisting since the first decoded packet. The Galactic Biological Survey did not have a framework for what was happening on Roman 4. Not an inadequate framework. Not a framework that needed updating. No framework at all. The species on that planet was operating outside the boundaries of every model, every timeline, every comfortable assumption the galaxy had built over 100,000 years of cataloging worlds. And the species didn't know that. It didn't know it was impossible. It was simply doing what it did, competing, adapting, building, breaking, iterating. And the fact that no other species had ever done it this fast was irrelevant to it, because it had no one to compare itself to. It was alone on its Deathworld, racing against itself, and it was winning. The chief engineer pulled up a comparative timeline on the hollow table, a chart showing the technological development curves of every spacefaring species in the Galactic database, plotted against time. The curves were long, gentle, predictable, hundreds of thousands of years of gradual progression, punctuated by occasional acceleration events, a resource discovery, a stable governance period, a breakthrough in fundamental physics. The Drethani curve was considered fast, stone tools to FTL in approximately 28,000 years. The Tethvari had been slower, 41,000. The galactic average was somewhere around 35,000 years. Roman 4 Alpha's curve was a vertical line. On the scale of the chart, it was indistinguishable from a species that had made the transition instantaneously. The chief engineer stared at it for a long time, then quietly closed the display. "The chart doesn't work," he said. "The axes aren't scaled for this. Nothing is scaled for this." On day 31, the species was broadcasting, not at the Cathalis but at each other. Millions of simultaneous radio transmissions. Voice, data, and music, organized acoustic patterns in complex harmonic structures. The linguists spent 3 days sorting the cacophony into categories, and emerged with a finding that reframed everything. At least 4,000 distinct languages, possibly many more. They developed thousands independently, the linguists said. Small Cathari, quiet, multifaceted eyes processing at uncomfortable speed. In parallel, then built translation systems to bridge between them. The diversity is evidence of competitive fragmentation. Thousands of groups, nations, tribes, factions, all competing for resources, territory, technological advantage. Each conflict drives innovation. Winners survive. Losers adapt or vanish. An evolutionary arms race between populations of the same species, running for 40,000 orbital cycles minimum. The stone tools were already the product of millennia of optimization. The probe was the catalyst. It gave them proof the universe was inhabited and aware. They incorporated that variable into their competitive framework, and they accelerated. Vetha thought about 1.6 billion individuals fragmented into thousands of competing groups, all attacking the same problem simultaneously from different angles. Not a unified effort, but 1,000 parallel experiments, each failure teaching the next attempt, each success immediately adopted, the most inefficient approach to any single problem, and the fastest because it tried everything at once and kept only what worked. Day 33 was the day Vetha began to understand that she was not merely observing an anomaly. She was witnessing a new category of event, something the Galactic Biological Survey had never encountered in its 11 million world database, something for which no protocol existed and no model could account. The weapons specialist's report on the arsenal complexes was the catalyst for that understanding, but it was not the report itself that changed her thinking. It was the conversation that followed. She had called a full crew meeting in the Cathalys's observation lab, the first since orbit insertion. All 19 specialists, seated around the central hollow table, the planet rotating slowly in miniature between them. She had asked each department head to present their most significant finding. The presentations took 4 hours. When they were done, she asked a question she had been turning over in her mind since the first decoded packet. How did they know to contact us? The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of scientists processing data, but the uneasy quiet of people confronting a question they had been avoiding. The probe, the communications officer said. They found the probe, decoded its systems, and used its encryption key to. No, Vetha said. I know the mechanism. I'm asking about the decision. How did they know that contacting the Galactic Biological Survey, specifically the survey, using its own formatting in its own protocol language, was the correct strategic move? The probe's memory core contained our encryption keys and communication protocols, yes. But it also contained the survey's organizational structure, our bureaucratic hierarchy, our reporting chains. They didn't just build a transmitter and broadcast blindly into space. They identified the specific organization that had sent the probe, determined the correct communication format that organization would recognize, and composed a message calibrated to trigger exactly the institutional response they wanted: a reclassification expedition, a return visit. The linguist leaned forward. You're suggesting the message was not merely a greeting. It was a strategic instrument. I'm suggesting that a species which has spent 40,000 years competing against itself at every level, military, economic, cultural, linguistic, is not going to approach its first interstellar interaction naively. They analyzed the probe the way a general analyzes a captured enemy document. They extracted not just the technical specifications but the institutional intelligence. They learned who sent it, how that organization communicated, what would motivate it to return. And then they crafted a message designed to produce exactly that outcome. Requesting reclassification, Orath said slowly, not requesting contact, not requesting technology exchange, reclassification. They asked us to update our assessment of them. Yes, which implies they understood what the original assessment was. They decoded enough of the probe's data to realize they had been classified as a non-threat, a contained species, below the monitoring threshold. And they sent us a message that said, in effect, your classification is wrong and you need to come back and see why. The chief engineer's lower hands were gripping the edge of the table. They wanted us to come. They engineered the contact to ensure we would come. They engineered the contact, Vetha said, to ensure we would come as observers, not as a threat, not as a military assessment team, as biologists, as scientists. They chose the survey, an unarmed research organization, because the survey would send an unarmed research vessel. They crafted the message to trigger a scientific response rather than a military one. The room was very still. Which means, Orath said, they are already thinking 3 moves ahead in an engagement that has not yet begun. Vetha did not respond to that. She did not need to. Every face in the room had arrived at the same conclusion. Day 35. The ethnographer, a meticulous Seathrani male whose species communicated primarily through bioluminescent patterns, and who had chosen xenoanthropology as a career, because he found other species' communication methods fascinatingly primitive, delivered a report that added weight to Vetha's assessment. He had been studying the species' settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and what could be inferred about their social organization from orbital observation. His conclusions were detailed and technical, but the summary was simple. The species organized itself into hierarchical groups at every scale, from family units to what appeared to be nation-states controlling entire continental regions. Each group competed for resources with neighboring groups. And this was the finding that made the ethnographer's bioluminescent patches flicker in patterns Vetha had never seen. The competition was not purely destructive. They trade, the ethnographer said, even between groups that are simultaneously engaged in military conflict. There are trade routes, commerce, exchange of goods, materials, and, I believe, information. They are fighting and cooperating at the same time, with the same groups, simultaneously. That's contradictory, the physician said. No, it's sophisticated. They have developed a social architecture that allows competition and cooperation to coexist. They fight over territory and trade across the borders they're fighting over. They develop weapons to use against each other and sell those weapons to the groups they might use them against. The entire system is a paradox by galactic standards, and it works. It works because competition without cooperation leads to mutual destruction, and cooperation without competition leads to stagnation. They have found the balance point between the two, and they are riding it at a speed that makes every other species in the database look stationary. Vetha thought about that. A species that competed and cooperated simultaneously, that fought and traded at the same time, that could hold two contradictory imperatives in its collective mind and pursue both without apparent cognitive dissonance. She thought about what that capacity would mean when the species turned its attention outward, when the groups on Roman 4 stopped competing only against each other and began competing against, and cooperating with, the rest of the galaxy. She thought about the welcome that had not yet been written on the ground. She thought about how the galaxy was not ready for a species that could shake your hand and pick your pocket at the same time, and genuinely mean both gestures. Day 33. The weapons specialist, Orath, tribal-armored Venthaki, broad-shouldered, slow-voiced, deliberate, amber eye shields evolved under a binary star, placed a tablet on Vetha's desk. Composite overhead image of a continent 3 coastal area, stitched from 16 orbital passes. Tell me what you see. Deepwater harbor sheltered by a curved peninsula, city of several 100,000, standard road network, industrial zones, residential districts, harbor filled with vessels. A port city, significant naval presence. The peninsula. Long, low buildings with reinforced rooflines. Open yards with geometric ground markings, assembly areas. Rows of identical structures in precise grids, barracks or storage. At the tip, earthwork fortifications surrounding a complex, the analysis software tagged in red. Arsenal. Weapons manufacturing at industrial scale. High-temperature metallurgy. Firearms, combustion-propelled metal projectiles, and that's one arsenal on one peninsula in one city on one continent. He paused. I've identified 63 similar facilities across 6 landmasses, some significantly larger. The office was silent. I served 12 years in the Venthaki perimeter fleet, assessed threat profiles for 31 species, read classified files on 90 more. I have never seen military-industrial capacity develop at this speed. They're not doing it because of us. They're doing it to each other. This is their baseline rate of weapons development in peacetime. He let that settle. When they unify and turn outward, the classification is not class 9, not class 12. I don't think we have a number. Vetha dismissed him, sat alone. 63 arsenals on 6 continents. She thought about the polite formatting of the original signal, the request for reclassification, phrased in the survey's own bureaucratic language, using the survey's own encryption. She wondered whether the politeness was genuine or calculated, whether a species this competitive would send a polite message because it was polite, or because it had determined politeness was the most effective way to bring the recipients closer. She thought about the probe, about the 4 minutes she had spent closing the file, about the confident assessment, threat rating, contained, that she had stamped with her credentials and her license number and sent into the archive without a second thought. She thought about the 12 to 14,000 year projection and how serene that number had seemed, how safe, how comfortable. 14,000 years. A span of time so vast that no living being in the galaxy would need to worry about it. Vetha's species would go through 40 generations before Ga-Trath-Roman 4 Alpha reached spaceflight. Except the projection was wrong by a factor of approximately 1,200. The species had not needed 14,000 years. It had needed 11. And it had done it, was still doing it, with no help, no guidance, no external technology beyond a single dead probe that it had found and cannibalized for information the way a predator strips a carcass for usable protein. The data supported either interpretation of the polite message, and Vetha realized, sitting alone in her darkened office, that it did not matter which interpretation was correct. Whether the species was friendly or hostile or both, the outcome was the same. It was coming. The only question was when, and the data suggested that when was measured in years, not centuries. She didn't know. The data supported either interpretation. The species might not have decided yet, might be pursuing both strategies through different factions, the way it pursued everything, and waiting to see which one worked. Day 37. The ship's physician, a quiet Orathi female, flagged a chemical signature in the atmospheric data from low orbit. Antibiotics. Synthesized pharmaceutical agents in trace quantities near major population centers. Industrial-scale production of compounds targeting microbial pathogens. Crude by galactic standards but functional. They're practicing industrial-scale medicine. They've identified disease agents and synthesized chemical responses. They're keeping their population alive through chemistry. Disease was a primary population limiter on Deathworlds. Remove it even partially and the growth curve bent hard upward. The species hadn't merely outbred the planet's attempts to kill it, it had begun systematically dismantling the mechanisms of death themselves. Disease via medicine, starvation via agricultural industrialization, predation via weapons, exposure via construction and heating. One by one, removing every natural check on their numbers, replacing each with infrastructure that let them grow faster. The physician's conclusion: this species does not accept environmental constraints. It identifies them, engineers around them, and uses the freed capacity to expand. The growth is deliberate, systematic elimination of every limiting factor. Vetha thought about the survey's threat assessment matrix, 17 categories, level 0 through level 16. Ga-Trath-Roman 4 Alpha had scored level 2 at the original assessment. Pre-industrial, planet-bound, the galactic equivalent of a species you could safely ignore for 10,000 years. The current data did not fit on the matrix at all, not because the species had reached level 16, but because the rate of change implied a trajectory that would blast through every remaining level in a timeframe the matrix's designers had never considered. The matrix assumed centuries between levels. This species was burning through them in years. Day 41 brought the war. Coordinated military conflict on Continent 4, 2 population centers, 300 kilometers apart, engaged in sustained combat. Thermal signatures, massed formations, thousands moving in organized infantry patterns. Explosive ordnance detonation at scale. 9 days of fighting. Orath watched every hour. No sleep rotation. The observation team took shifts. He didn't. He sat at his station for 9 consecutive days, sleeping in his chair in 2-hour intervals, eating at his console, recording everything. The conflict was methodical. Both sides moved in coordinated formations that the tactical software recognized as disciplined infantry maneuvers. Not mob charges, not tribal raids, but organized military operations with clear command structures, supply lines, flanking movements, and what appeared to be real-time tactical communication between field units and a centralized command authority. The ordnance signatures showed consistent blast radii, suggesting standardized weapons with predictable performance characteristics. Not improvised explosives, but manufactured munitions produced to specification. When it ended, one city had expanded its border by 40 kilometers. The other had contracted. The observation team cataloged the aftermath. The winning population center had already begun construction on newly acquired territory, roads, supply depots, agricultural irrigation into farmland that had belonged to the other city 72 hours earlier. The speed of transition from combat to construction was unsettling. No pause, no recovery period, no mourning as far as the sensors could determine. The species treated destruction and construction as a single continuous process. Orath's report was 3 sentences. Every engagement is a laboratory. Every war is a development cycle. They iterate. What disturbed Vetha most was not the conflict itself. Wars between competing populations were common in pre-FTL species, documented across hundreds of worlds. What disturbed her was the aftermath. The winning city did not rest. It did not consolidate. It did not celebrate. Within 48 hours of the conflict's conclusion, the thermal signatures showed organized labor crews moving into the contested territory, laying infrastructure at a pace that suggested the construction had been planned before the fighting started, that the city had gone to war with architectural blueprints already drawn for the land it intended to take. The losing city, meanwhile, had not collapsed. It had contracted, yes, lost territory, lost population, lost resources. But the thermal signatures showed it regrouping, reorganizing, and already beginning to rebuild. The construction patterns on its remaining territory were denser than before the conflict, as if the population had responded to the loss by intensifying its development on the land it still held. It was not dying. It was compressing, concentrating, getting smaller and harder and more efficient, the way a material under pressure becomes denser and stronger. Both cities emerged from the war more capable than they had been before it started. The winner had more territory and resources. The loser had more efficiency and desperation. And both would carry the tactical lessons of the engagement into their next conflict, iterating on what had worked and discarding what had not, the way a blade is sharpened by being drawn across a stone. Vetha documented the conflict in her report with the clinical detachment the survey required, but her private notes, written in her personal journal, which was not part of the official record, were less measured. She wrote, "We classify species as predators or prey. We classify civilizations as developing or developed. We have no classification for a species that is simultaneously predator and prey to itself, that uses internal predation as the mechanism of its own development. We have no framework for understanding what happens when that mechanism encounters an external target. We have no precedent. We have no models. We have only the data, and the data says, they have been doing this for 40,000 years, and they are getting faster." She closed the journal and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the hum of the ship's environmental systems, which suddenly seemed very fragile. Day 45, Continent 6, instrumented boreholes, geothermal investigation. The chief engineer called it the ratchet, each solved problem becoming a tool for the next, knowledge never going backward, each ceiling broken becoming a floor for the next structure. The ratchet turned one way, faster every year. Day 48. A finding the observation team almost missed. On Continent 2, the most densely populated landmass, the optical sensors detected a large cleared area adjacent to one of the major cities. The clearing was rectangular, approximately 2 kilometers by half a kilometer, and it was being systematically leveled and paved with a dark composite material. "Runway," Oreth said, before anyone else identified it. The Venthaki weapons specialist looked at the image and saw what his military training told him was there: a prepared surface for the landing and takeoff of atmospheric vehicles. Not spacecraft, not yet, but the species had already demonstrated combustion propulsion. If it had developed internal combustion to the point of powering wheeled vehicles and ocean-going warships, the logical next step was atmospheric flight. And if it was building a runway, it was either already flying or expected to be flying soon. The team reviewed the optical records from the previous 47 orbital passes and found 3 more cleared areas on 3 different continents, each in a similar configuration: flat, paved, rectangular, adjacent to a major population center or military installation. 4 runways, 4 continents. "They're developing aircraft," the chief engineer confirmed. His voice was carefully neutral. "The construction pattern is consistent with early-stage aviation infrastructure across 14 documented galactic species. The fact that they're building on 4 continents simultaneously suggests multiple competing aviation programs. Different factions, different approaches, the same competitive fragmentation we've observed in every other domain. Multiple competing aviation programs, running simultaneously, on a planet that had been using stone tools 11 years ago. Vetha added it to the growing list of capabilities the species was developing faster than any model predicted. The list was long. It was getting longer, and every new entry on it brought the species closer to the one capability that would change everything: the ability to leave. Day 41. Coordinated military conflict on Continent 4. 2 population centers 300 kilometers apart engaged in sustained combat. Thermal signatures, massed formations, thousands, possibly tens of thousands moving in organized infantry patterns. Explosive ordnance at scale. 9 days. Oreth watched the entire conflict. No sleep rotation. When it ended, one city had expanded its border by 40 kilometers. The other had contracted, he said. "They're testing weapons on each other. Every engagement is a laboratory. Every war is a development cycle. Losers adapt or die. Winners incorporate what worked, discard what didn't, iterate. 40,000 years, better tools." The observation team cataloged the aftermath. The winning population center had already begun construction on the newly acquired territory, laying roads, establishing supply depots, expanding agricultural irrigation into farmland that had belonged to the other city 48 hours earlier. The speed of the transition from combat to construction was unsettling. The species did not pause between destroying and building. It appeared to view them as the same process: clearing obstacles and filling the cleared space with something useful. Day 45. The geologist reported excavations on Continent 6, the smallest, most geologically unstable landmass. Narrow, deep boreholes in geometric patterns, instrumented with metallic devices at specific depths. They're studying their own geology, systematically. If they've figured out that geothermal energy is accessible, and on a world this tectonically active, the potential output would exceed combustion infrastructure by orders of magnitude. Another constraint identified, another ceiling being measured for demolition. The chief engineer had a term for it, used privately, not in any official log. He called it the ratchet. Once they solved a problem, they never unsolved it. The knowledge never went backward. Each solved problem became a tool for solving the next. Each broken ceiling became a floor for the next structure. The ratchet only turned one way, and it was turning faster every year. Day 50. The linguist arrived with her multifaceted eyes reflecting in a pattern Vetha had never seen, the Cathari equivalent of profound unease. I've decoded enough of the dominant language broadcasts to understand the content. And they're debating us. Multiple sources on Continent 1 organized discussions about extraterrestrial contact, whether we're hostile, what our technology implies, strategies for first contact, defense scenarios. All in public broadcast. Public. Anyone with a receiver can listen. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, engaged in distributed strategic analysis. Some advocate diplomacy. Some advocate weapons development against orbital threats. Some advocate concealment. Some advocate all strategies simultaneously by different factions in parallel. Hedging, competing, fragmenting, pursuing every approach at once, letting results determine the winner, except the variable isn't territory, it's survival against an unknown external threat, and the sophistication of the strategic thinking exceeds anything I've documented from a single species. They have already, in their public broadcasts, articulated strategic scenarios that parallel classified Galactic Security Council wargame projections. They arrived at the same conclusions independently, without access to any of the data that informed those projections. They did it by thinking about the problem from every possible angle simultaneously, through thousands of competing minds. Day 52. An unexpected finding from the atmospheric chemist that had nothing to do with technology or weapons or population growth, and that shook Vetha more deeply than any of the others. The species was modifying its own food supply at the genetic level. The atmospheric chemist had detected trace signatures of selective plant breeding, not the slow, generational selection that every agricultural species practiced, but something more aggressive. The cultivated plants on Rathrome 4 showed genetic variation patterns consistent with deliberate cross-pollination experiments conducted at scale, across multiple continental regions, producing crop variants with higher yields, greater resistance to the planet's aggressive fungal pathogens, and shorter growth cycles. The species was not just farming. It was engineering its food supply, reshaping the biology of other organisms to serve its needs, the same way it reshaped rivers and mountains and the electromagnetic spectrum. They're not adapting to their environment, Vetha said aloud, to the empty observation lab at 2 in the morning on day 53. They're adapting their environment to themselves. It was the most dangerous sentence she had ever spoken, because a species that adapted its environment rather than adapting to it had no natural ceiling. Every other species in the database had eventually reached an equilibrium, a point where the environment's constraints and the species' capabilities balanced, and development slowed to a crawl. Rathrome 4 Alpha did not seek equilibrium. It sought dominance, over its diseases, over its predators, over its geography, over its own genome, eventually, if the agricultural genetic modification was any indication. Over everything. She sat with that understanding for a long time. She thought about the 11 million species in the survey database, 11 million worlds, 11 million life forms, 11 million developmental trajectories, all of them conforming to the same broad pattern: slow development, eventual equilibrium, stable civilization. The galaxy was old and comfortable precisely because every species in it had reached a ceiling and stopped pushing. Resources were finite. Physics imposed limits. Biology imposed limits, and every species eventually accepted those limits and found its place. Rathrome 4 Alpha did not accept limits. It broke them. It broke them the way its tectonic forces broke the crust of its own planet, violently, continuously, and without any indication that it would ever stop. And the galaxy, Vetha realized with a cold clarity that felt like drowning, had been built on the assumption that every species eventually stopped. Every institution, every treaty, every defensive doctrine, every threat assessment matrix. All of it was predicated on the idea that development had a natural ceiling. What happened when a species arrived that didn't have one? Day 54, Oreth's second meeting. Near the largest arsenal on Continent 3, a structure under construction in a dry dock, 400 meters long, 70 wide, iron, steel, heavy alloys. The structural profile was wrong for a building or a factory. A ship, an ocean-going warship dwarfing everything in the harbor, reinforced ribbing consistent with armored hull design. Compartmentalization patterns found in military vessels across 17 galactic species. Mounting points classified at 91% confidence as weapons platforms. Building a warship from scratch, stone tools 11 years ago. The design is entirely their own, Oreth said. Engineered from first principles, and they're getting faster. The Arsenal complex has expanded since we first imaged it, in 21 days. Vetha thought about that. 21 days. An arsenal expanded while simultaneously fighting a war on a different continent, broadcasting strategic debates, drilling scientific boreholes, and building cities faster than infrastructure could support. The species didn't do things one at a time. It did everything at once, all the time, everywhere. The sheer parallelism of it. The ability to run a civilization's worth of simultaneous projects without any apparent central coordination, without any single authority directing the effort, just thousands of competing groups each pursuing their own objectives, and the aggregate result being progress on every front at once, was something the survey had no framework for modeling. Every galactic civilization the survey had cataloged had developed through centralized coordination. A governing body identified priorities, allocated resources, directed effort. It was efficient. It was orderly. It was how civilizations worked. This species had no centralized coordination. It had competition, and competition, it turned out, was faster. Day 58. Narrowbeam radio scan from Continent 1. Focused search pattern covering the exact orbital corridor where the probe's telemetry indicated a returning ship would appear. Scanning for the Cathales, in the right patch of sky. Vetha ordered higher orbit. The silence had texture. 19 scientists, realizing the thing they'd watched, already knew they were there. Day 60. Heat bloom, 90 seconds. Chemical combustion, vertical. An object accelerating upward, reaching 47 kilometers before gravity reclaimed it. Suborbital test, crude, hadn't reached space. But it had gone up. 47 kilometers into the mesosphere of a deathworld with an atmosphere so violent the climatologist had documented hurricanes that flattened cities. And the species had thrown a metal tube through it on a column of chemical fire. And for 90 seconds, something they built existed above the weather and the clouds and the killing surface of their world, in the thin air at the edge of space. 90 seconds. A stone thrown at the sky by a child who couldn't yet reach the stars. The beginning of the end of the galaxies, monopoly on space. Solid fuel chemical propulsion, the engineer said, all 4 hands still. Crude, dangerous, a proof of concept. How long until orbital insertion? Long silence. At their current rate, months. And once they achieve orbit, the next step is orbital manufacturing. The step after that is the propulsion system they already designed and sent us before they could leave their own planet. They planned this. The signal, the schematic, the census, they sent us their resume. Day 62, the final piece. Optical sensors captured the night side of Continent 1 through a gap in cloud cover. A pattern of lights, brighter than any city, geometric, too regular for urban lighting. Thousands of individual light sources on an open plane, arranged with mathematical precision. Vetha studied the image for an hour. Can you decode the shape? 11 minutes. The linguist cross-referenced the probe's graphemic analysis. A character from the dominant writing system, the largest nation on Continent 1. Her voice was very quiet, multifaceted eyes reflecting the image, thousands of facets, one pattern. It means welcome. They had seen the ship. Built a display visible from orbit. Thousands of light sources, mathematically arranged, burning through the night. Hello, we see you, welcome. The observation team stared in silence. Vetha looked at her crew, 19 specialists from 7 species, and saw the same expression on every face, translated through 7 biological architectures into one universal meaning. Fear, not of the message, of what it implied. Because the species had detected the ship, calculated what would be visible from orbital altitude, organized the construction of a light display covering hundreds of acres, coordinated thousands of participants, and chosen, out of all possible messages in 4,000 languages, a single word that meant the opposite of threat. A species simultaneously building warships, manufacturing firearms, fighting wars, and debating orbital defense had written "welcome" in lights visible from space. And Vetha could not tell whether that word was sincere or strategic, whether it came from the faction that wanted peace or the one that wanted to draw observers closer, whether the species even distinguished between those impulses, or simply did both at once and waited to see which worked. She filed her final report at 03:14 on day 63. 61 pages, 2-sentence summary. The species designated Ga-Trathroman 4 alpha has exceeded all projected developmental timelines by a factor that renders the original survey assessment categorically invalid. I recommend immediate reclassification to Deathworld Prime and the convening of a full Galactic Security Council review to evaluate containment feasibility before this species achieves independent interstellar capability, which I estimate will occur within 15 to 20 of their orbital cycles, and which may occur sooner, given that we have underestimated them at every previous assessment. She transmitted, then sat in her darkened office, viewport open, watching the planet turn, the blue-green marble with its violent weather and geological fury and impossible cities, and 1.6 billion competitive, cooperative, relentlessly adapting inhabitants who had gone from stone tools to radio telescopes to suborbital rockets to a light display that said welcome to the strangers watching from orbit, all in 11 years. She understood, with a certainty that settled into her thorax and bones like ice, that containment was not feasible. It had never been feasible. The moment the original probe touched that surface and left behind galactic technology for the most aggressively adaptive species in the cataloged record to find, decode, reverse engineer, and improve upon, the outcome was fixed. They were coming, not in 15 years, not in 20, sooner, because a species that went from chipping stones to suborbital flight in 11 years was not bound by anyone else's timelines. It wrote its own. It always had. And the galaxy, vast, slow, ancient, comfortable, 100,000 years of cataloging and filing and archiving and moving on, was not ready. It would never be ready. Vetha watched the planet turn. On the night side, the lights burned, millions of them, bright and steady and patient, spreading across every continent like something alive, covering more ground than a week ago, pushing outward into the dark with the quiet certainty of a species that had decided darkness was a problem and had solved it. She did not file for reassignment. She did not recommend additional probes. She thought about the board reading her report in comfortable offices on Kelth Station, processing the data through familiar models, applying standard frameworks. She thought about the Security Council convening to discuss containment, drawing up plans based on precedents that did not apply and timelines that did not hold. She thought about the galaxy, old, slow, comfortable, built on 100,000 years of predictable curves and safe assessments. And she thought about the vertical line on the chief engineer's chart, the line that went straight up off the top of the display because nothing in the database was scaled for it. The galaxy would respond to her report. It would deliberate, It would form committees. It would commission studies. It would debate options. It would follow protocols. It would do everything slowly and carefully and by the book, the way it always had, because the galaxy had never needed to move fast. No threat had ever required urgency. Every species in the database had given the galaxy centuries to respond. This species would not give it centuries. This species did not give anyone time. It took time. It compressed it. It broke it like it broke everything else, by throwing a billion minds at the problem and refusing to accept the answer that said not yet. She simply noted, in the margins of her own report, a single line the board would read months later and recognize as the most honest sentence in the entire 61 pages. I should not have closed that file.